During this webinar, titled HLA-DP, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, the speakers will discuss HLA-DP typing and antibody assessments with an emphasis on evaluating donor-recipient compatibility for solid organ transplantation. This presentation will be recorded for future viewing through the Linkage Biosciences and One Lambda websites. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. It is now my pleasure to turn today's program over to our presenters, Dr. Gebel and Bray.
Thanks very much, Matthew. This is Howie Gebel, and just to begin with, we are having a disclosure statement, disclaimer and disclosure. You can see on here that while we are going to be talking about HLA-DP antigens and antibodies, we are going to be expressing some of our own opinions, and they are ours and no one else's. We have received honoraria from Thermo Fisher to give this lecture. So let's start with some background. Presently, as of July 10, 2017, off of the IMGT website, there are about 894 different DP beta-1 alleles. That's at the DNA level, which corresponds to 641 different proteins. So in September or December, I wouldn't be surprised if we're up over 1,000. The issue is that of all those different alleles, there are only 30 that are represented on single antigen bead products. And that means that assessing compatibility between donors and recipients for recipients who have lots of different DP antibodies, it's a challenging issue to try to determine that compatibility. As we go forward in history, as we think about the history of it, let's go back to when it was first described. It was originally described as SB, and that stands for secondary B cells, and it was shown that it contains genes encoding alpha and beta chains of a heterodimeric cell surface glycoprotein participating in antigen presentation. On the next slide, we can go even further back in history and see that it was about 40 years ago that what we now refer to as HLA-DP was first discussed. And I would venture to say that the majority of people who are listening in on this webinar haven't heard about a mixed lymphocyte culture, let alone a secondary mixed lymphocyte culture, let alone actually performed a secondary mixed lymphocyte culture reaction. But that is how the derivation of DP first came into being. In 1983, there was additional data that at the time was coming out of Jack Strominger's laboratory, and using the most sophisticated techniques that were available at the time, a class II beta cDNA chain from a human B-cell cDNA library was probed with a mouse IA gene, which is a mouse class II probe. And by the most sophisticated DNA sequence analysis that was available, it was shown that this new product was different from what we now know as HLA-DQ, HLA-DR beta 3, 4, 5, or from HLA-DR beta 1. And eventually, by 1984, HLA-DP was named, and that's how we've been referring to it ever since. We go to a map of chromosome 6 and look specifically at the histocompatibility region. We see that HLA-DP maps to the class II region and specifically maps to the centromeric side of HLA-DQ. If you take a look at the structure of the DP molecule, it's a typical class II molecule. It's got an alpha chain and a beta chain. If somebody were to force you to say, what does that HLA-DP molecule look like? Does it look more like a DR? Does it look more like a DQ? I would answer that it looks more like a DQ, primarily because the DP alpha chain is also polymorphic, as is the DQ alpha chain. So it does present antigen, and it has the characteristics of a typical class II antigen.
So that was a very nice overview of the history, Howie, but now let's talk about something a little more exciting and what people are really interested in here, and that's a little bit about the clinical relevance of HLA-DP antibody. So while there are some publications around DP, there's not a huge supply of publications. So we've tried to pick a few. There may be a few other ones out there, but these are just some of the highlights of things that relate to the clinical relevance of DP. So in the top half of the slide was some early data in 2005 published by Marie-Louise Arnold and Ralph Wasmuth's lab in Germany. And it was interesting. They had a cohort of patients who had lost their graft. All of these were taken off of immunosuppression. Most of them had transplant nephrectomies at the time. And in this cohort, they looked at 93% of these people made a class 2 antibody, DSA, after the cessation of immunosuppression and nephrectomy. And interesting, of this cohort, 89% of them produced DP specificities as well, in addition to a compilation of DR and DQ. And that if you look at the number a little closer, that's 24 out of 25, or 96% of these people made a DP antibody. And I think people who are in this business a long time recognize that with the new technologies, we are seeing a good number of patients with DP antibodies. Majority of the time, they are patients who are regraft patients that have these antibodies, although we have seen them occasionally in individuals with multip females, not so much in transfusion-related, but they do occur in other non-transplanted individuals. The next bottom half of the slide is a publication from the UPenn group, and Malik Kamoun is the senior author on this, and they talked about 2 case reports of individuals who lost their grafts soon after transplant. One was lost at 20 months, one was lost at about 13 months. In both cases, the only antibody they could find that was HLA was a DP-related antibody. Both cases had C4D positive AMR graft rejection, and their conclusion was that DP was the cause of the graft loss, and this was preformed DP antibody. On this slide here, we have a group from the UK, Craig Taylor being one of the senior authors on this publication. Again, they had 2 case reports in this looking at individuals who had lost grafts within a year or so after transplant, and in both of these graft loss scenarios, a DP antibody was the only explanation for the graft loss. That was antibody-mediated rejection and C4D deposition. The bottom half of this slide is our colleagues from Canada. Many people have recognized many of the names on this particular slide. And they had 2 patients, again, who had lost their grafts, and both of them around 6 months post-transplant. Again, DPB antibodies were the only ones associated with graft loss. I believe one of the patients had a DPB and a DPA antibody in this study, and all were documented C4D positive antibody-mediated rejection in this case. Another publication from our colleagues over in France basically looked at the contribution of C and or DP in graft loss. As these 2 graphics show, on the left-hand side was freedom from acute rejection episode, and you can see the bottom line are patients who had C and or DP was much, much lower in freedom from rejection. And on the right-hand side is freedom from antibody-mediated rejection episode, as well as also lower in patients who had C or DP antibodies. And that was a recent article from 2016. Of course. In work that was published a few years ago from the group up at Montefiore Medical Center, and Envar Aklin, nephrologist up there who's heading the transplant program, a former fellow here at Emory, who does very nice work, looked at all their sensitized patients. And they defined sensitized in this article as anybody who had a PRA greater than 0. And they showed that across all of these quote-unquote sensitized patients, the incidence of DP antibodies was about 8% of their total patient population, which sounds a little low. Subsequent to that publication, we at Emory, with 5 other centers, looked at a more interesting statistic, and then we looked at truly highly sensitized patients, people with CPRAs of 98% or higher, and looked at the incidence of DPB or A or DQ alpha in this population. And across these centers, our average was greater than 60%. And this was done in kind of response to help the UNOS people make a decision to include DQA and DPB in the algorithm for excluding individuals and adding these as unacceptable antibodies to the UNOS to the UNOS drop-down in UNET, because, as we know now, we're shipping, up to a third of the kidneys are now shipped for our 99 and 100% CPRA individuals. And the point here is that in the individuals that we're trying to ship kidneys across the country, DP is a major player and can be a major impediment to transplantation. And there was some of this data that helped drive UNOS to adopt the DQA and DPB as unacceptables in UNET. Not to leave our friends out in the bone marrow transplant side, we know now from a number of studies. This is just one that we were part and parcel with the National Marrow Donor Program that looked at the impact of preformed antibody on graft failure in individuals. And while there's a very strong association with preformed antibody, preformed DSA in these cases, and failed engraftment, we note here that in 6 of the 11 failures, the primary antibody that was present was a DPB antibody that we think was associated with the failed engraftment. And lastly, on this slide here was some work that we participated with our colleagues over at Charleston at Medical University of South Carolina with a single patient who failed to engraft, and the only mismatched antigen was a DPB0301. He had a very high titer DP antibody, failed the first transplant. They initiated pheresis in IVIG and brought the antibody down, and they were fortunate enough to go back to the same donor and recollect from this donor and reinfuse this gentleman, and he survived, and he's, as of talking of a few months ago, the guy is alive and well, doing just fine following the second transplant, but we believe that the antibody in this case was responsible for the failed engraftment. Removing the antibody and engrafting this individual led to a successful transplant.
Well, thanks, Bob. I think what you've done is you've put together a very nice series of cases that certainly convince me that if a patient has DP antibody, we need to at least give pause and pay respect to it and recognize that it's a potential problem, let our clinical colleagues know before they move forward with a transplant. And the rest of the community began to feel the same way, and as Bob alluded to, there was a change in UNOS policy. And on this slide we see that in November 2014, the UNOS Board of Directors mandated that DP beta and LIDQ alpha typing be performed for every deceased donor. And in January of 2016, so a full year later, a year and 2 months, programming was finally completed where the above mandate became effective and it was feasible to start looking at these antigens as voids. Now, with this, we have to recognize that the nomenclature for HLA-DP is a bit occurred in 2010. Prior to 2010, what we had was for virtually all the antigens, 4 digits as a reporting phenomenon. And the problem is, by the time you got to antigen number 100, you were past being able to use only the 4 digits. And we needed to incorporate a new methodology, and this is where the colons came into play. And as you can see, what happened with that, alleles that had been previously named at the 4-digit level were changed to the 5-digit level or beyond to make certain that there was no overlap. So in particular, DP beta 1 0102 became 100:01. 0203 became 101:01. 0302 became 10201, etc. As we look at the next slide, what we had prior to 2010 was a nomenclature that attempted to name alleles according to their similarity. And for example, one would have 0201 and 0202 as 4-digit reports, and those two seemingly had sequences that were much alike. The new nomenclature lost that ability, and things were just named in numerical order. For example, right now we have DP beta 1 618:01, which is now an 0401G, whereas 64701 is an 0402G. So we have lots and lots of alleles that, without some form of map, without some form of legend, we don't know how they correspond to previously existing alleles. This is a problem that every one of us are facing on a routine basis.
So, as Howie was alluding to, we have a number of challenges with DPB1. The structural relationship between alleles is not conveyed with the new DPB1 nomenclature, as he alluded to. And there's only about 30 of the 600 alleles are represented on single antigen beads. And so for donors with DPB1 alleles that are not represented on the single antigen bead panel, patients that possess DPV1 antibodies may not be appropriately screened off the UNOS match run. What that leads to is that the final assessment of this compatibility for such patients has to be determined at the local level by the HLA laboratory personnel, directors, supervisors, and staff. You get offered a kidney in the middle of the night, and it's typed as a DP 25701. Well, what do you do with that? How do you handle that kind of data? Here's some data on this next slide here that we published a couple of years ago with a student we had in the lab, Aaron Karras. And he looked back at about 1,250 of our deceased donors typed here at Emory. And we did a couple little bit of analysis. So first of all, we calculated the frequency of occurrence of the DPB1 alleles as a function of different ethnic groups that we had as donors in the Atlanta area. And on the left-hand side of the slide, you see some boxes that are highlighted in yellow. Those highlighted boxes represent the alleles that are also present on the 1 lambda single antigen bead assay kit today. We also highlighted in green are alleles that occurred in some of the major populations at a frequency of at least 1%. And as you can see, there's not a lot of coincidence between the yellow and the green boxes per se. And if we look at the little red asterisks up there, this is if you run the supplemental trays from 1 lambda, you add a few more alleles that are present. But at the end of the day, we still have several alleles, for example, 3601, 3901, 49, 63, that occur at frequencies in our populations greater than 1%, and we absolutely have no beads to assess whether or not a person who has an antibody is going to react with that particular bead or not. Just as a little aside, if we look at the 1 lambda beads in a little more detail, we find that they also have a 2801, which is a predominantly an Asian antigen, and we found no occurrences in our population here in Georgia. And I also ran a CP area at the Canadian website, and it came up with a CP area of 0 as well. But yet they take up 3 slots on the single antigen bead. We've talked to the company about this, but just something to be aware of.
So now that means we have to address the variety of different challenges that we're faced with as regarding how we identify antigens and the antibodies that we can detect on these single antigen beads. And again, this does present a challenge day to day in the laboratory. So the approach that we have taken is based on multiple different publications that have shown over and over again that there are 6 hypervariable regions of the HLA-DP molecule that account for the vast majority of antibody activity against HLA-DP beta-1 alleles. And a ribbon diagram, a cartoon of an HLA class 2 molecule is shown here in a pretty bright green, and circled with letters next to them are the 6 different hypervariable regions that are labeled as A, B, C, D, E, and F, and on this diagram show you where those different hypervariable regions are. And what do we mean by hypervariable? It means that there's a lot of polymorphism that exists, especially in these spots. And that's shown on this next slide out of a paper that was published in 2009 out of the Netherlands. And here we can just look at a variety of different HLA-DP beta-1 alleles, and across these 6 different hypervariable regions, you see the sequences that are present at each of those different regions. So for example, on the extreme right side, that hypervariable region is the DP equivalent of an HLA B4 or B6. Every person who is with a couple of exceptions, every person whose HLA-D has DP antigens is either going to be a DEAV or a GGPM. So you can be homozygous for DEAV, you can be homozygous for GGPM, or you can be heterozygous. And as I said, there are a couple of exceptions that we can discuss at a later time. But what we see is, and I've alluded to it before, the vast majority of DP antibodies that we find in our patients are directed at one or more of these hypervariable region polymorphisms. And what we show here on the top part of the slide is what the patient's HLA type is. And you can see the patient is homozygous for GGPM. The donor is heterozygous for DEAV and GGPM, and that means that the recipient has the ability to recognize DEAV as different and theoretically can make a response. And sure enough, this patient, when you take a look at serum that occurred post-transplant after a rejection episode, you see that every bead that was DEAV positive, or every positive bead expressed DEAV. So it turns out that over 75% of the antibodies that are reported in the literature are primarily directed at hypervariable region F or at hypervariable region C. And there are a variety of others that can occur, but 75% are clearly expressed by those two alone.
So continuing on with that philosophy, there's some nice work that was published by René Duquesnoy in classifying these alleles. This is just one of the papers that he recently published. And in the table there, he's actually showing where he has confirmed at least 3 of these particular epitopes, the B epitope, the C, and the F epitope, through antibody studies, and confirmed that these really are viable epitopes that people can make antibodies against. And as Howie said, it's predominantly the C and the F epitope were the majority of them, but he also has documented that the B epitope has also been defined serologically through studies. And in fact, if you want more information on the DP epitopes, and specifically looking at your particular patients, there's a link here to a really nice website. It's helped maintained by people in Brazil, and obviously managed predominantly by René Duquesnoy and his group. But you can click on the DP database. And briefly, what we look here is just one snapshot. If you look at this F epitope here, we see the sequences on the left that are associated with the F epitope. And what you can see, as we mentioned, this epitope here, which is the DEAV epitope, has been confirmed serologically through antibody reactivity. The GGPM epitope has been confirmed by serological reactivity. If we look over underneath the title here, Luminex alleles, if you click on any one of these more buttons, which I can't right now in our talk, it will show you the string of alleles that are represented by all of the manufacturer's single antigen bead products. It's not quite up to date, so it's missing a couple current newer ones, but for the most part, it picks up those alleles that are represented by the single antigen beads. You can see what that repertoire should be. And in essence, if you have an antibody pattern, if you're not sure what it is, you can click on the epitope list here, alleles, and if it matches perfectly with your antibody reactivity, you can then trace that back and say, okay, that's likely explained by this particular epitope. If we move a little over to the right where I have in fuchsia color here, if you click on the More button, this will open up a string, as I have down here, of all the alleles from the IMGT website that express, in this case, the GGPM epitope, this confirmed. So you get the list of all the potential alleles. The only drawback to this website right now, it's a little bit out of date. It only stops at DPB 99. Right now, as we've indicated, the highest GGPM is 663.01. Highest DEAV is 664. I understand this is a challenge because it almost seems like new DPB alleles are coming out every day. I think every quarter they're adding at least another 20 alleles to the IMGT website. But anyway, this is a very useful website that you can go play around with, look at your antibody reactivities on the beads, map this back to epitopes, and maybe even contribute to people learning more and supporting this website by confirming particular epitopes. If one's not on here, it's confirmed. If it's provisional and you have a very good sera, I encourage you to get in contact with René, and maybe you can be part and parcel of helping us better understand this antibody reactivity.
So with all these data, we now have some practical considerations that we may be able to begin applying. So our approach is that for any given DP beta-1 allele, the reasoning is that donor-recipient compatibility for the vast majority of candidates could be assessed by looking at the epitope reactivity of the 6 hypervariable regions that the recipient possesses or doesn't possess antibodies to, and then comparing the profile of the antibodies that we see in our patient to the same hypervariable regions, the corresponding hypervariable regions in the donor. So let's take a look at a given example. Here we have a patient who themselves type as a 0201, 0401, and the donor, I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball in here, is an 8501, where we know we don't have a bead. If we take a look at the reactivity patterns of this patient's serum pre-transplant, we see outlined in the red rectangle are all the positive DP beads. And on the right side, outlined in green, are all the DP negative beads. When we're now thinking about this particular donor-recipient combination, we're asking, are they compatible or incompatible? And the first question is, can we identify, is there one or more certain combination of antibodies to the hypervariable regions that account for these reactivities? And as we continue looking at the reactivity patterns, everything that's highlighted in red expresses the DEAV sequence in the F hypervariable region, and everything that's negative is in the GGPM family. And this is a very, very clear-cut case which jumps right out at you. And what we would do at our institution is any DEAV allele would be considered incompatible for this particular recipient. And at this point, we still have to find out what 8501 expresses.
So in order to do that, one of the tools I use, and this is a little lesson in just understanding the DPB1 sequence motif. So what I've done here is I've put a list of alleles on the left-hand side here. You don't have to see them. I don't need you to remember the alleles. Just the colors are the most important thing here. And highlighted in yellow up here top is the DPB10101, which is used as a consensus sequence for DPB. And all the rest of these alleles shown below here are all related in some way to the DPB101 allele. So let's talk about the first level of relationship. So here I've highlighted in green a series of alleles, and these alleles represent the G or P alleles for DPB0101, 162, 417, 462, 616. And by that we mean that all these alleles down here at the bottom share all 6 hypervariable regions with DPB10101, and they only differ outside of exon 2. This little dark line that I have here is the delineation between exon 2 and exon 3, and as you can see for 2 of the alleles here, there's a polymorphism outside of exon 2. And by definition, these would be G alleles. All the sequences are exactly the same, and the only difference occurs outside of exon 2. The next, and these are our G or P alleles. The next level of alleles are what we've termed, Howie and I have coined this term GP plus alleles. And by that I mean everything circled in red here represent alleles. If you look across, they all share the same 6 hypervariable regions. They're all the same, except they have a single polymorphism in most cases, someplace present within exon 2, but outside of one of the 6 hypervariable regions. And our belief is that it may be that these, and we'd have to prove this through serological studies, may not really impact the antibody reactivity of things. For example, there's only 1 or 2 polymorphisms over here that might impact reactivity with the DEAV. If a person had an antibody against DEAV, all these would be positive except this one here, which has the GGPM allele. And so we call these G or P plus, which meaning that they share all same 6 epitopes, have a sequence difference within exon 2, but it's not within those 6 particular epitopes. We'll come back and revisit this concept in just a minute. And last, we have a set of alleles who differ within one of the 6 hypervariable regions. So here we have a difference here, and we have differences in the D epitope here, a difference in the E epitope, and we have this one difference out here where this actually looks like a swap between the DEAV GGPM, where all the alleles are, the sequence is exactly the same except for that one little motif that had swapped. We see this very common in class 1 alleles, and a good example of this in class 1, since this actual position of this F allele is very close and maps to almost the same physical spot as BW4 and BW6. So the way you could think about these 2 alleles here is B53 and 35. They only differ by, one's a BW4 and one's a BW6. The same thing, these 2 alleles here differ by only this sequence motif. It's just kind of interesting that evolutionarily DP has developed this dimorphism out there. There must be some functional significance to this that we don't understand yet. But anyway, these alleles are exactly the same over all of the regions except there's some polymorphism within one of the 6 hypervariable regions, and we've just titled these OMG alleles. It gets pretty complicated. But these last concepts are what we think about when we do analysis of patients in doing typing to try to understand what the sequence motif is of a particular allele that's not covered by a bead, and how we would relate those sequence motifs back to an antibody profile that somebody has, and then try to match those up to make the determination, does this represent a compatible HLA allele or an incompatible DPD1 allele?
So what Bob just showed you, I can tell you from personal experience that he spent a great deal of time on creating that Excel spreadsheet, and we're talking about hours upon hours, for days, to have a tool that would be useful in the middle of the night. It still required, as far as I was concerned, some extra manipulation that I prefer not to go through at 3 o'clock in the morning. And what I was hoping for was just a button that I could push. And I had this idea, but certainly no way to implement it. And I continued to use Bob's approach because it was fantastic compared to what I was using, which was going through each and every line of the IMGT sequence database. But I knew that there was a way, if we could get somebody who knew code, to put together a more user-friendly computer-assisted device to help determine donor-recipient compatibility. And so for that, I'd like to give special thanks to Dr. Jeffrey Smith. Jeff is now the head of IT in pathology, and before he went to medical school, Jeff was an Oracle programmer. And I gave him one day the idea of what I was looking for, figuring it was going to take him about a year. I gave it to him on a Friday afternoon, and I figured it was going to be a good long time before I heard anything back. Sunday at midnight, I have a prototype that we're going to begin to use. It's simply amazing what he was able to do. So what we want to do is take a look and data reduce how we think about the hypervariable regions. And the way Bob and I have been talking about it lately is on the left side, we look at the hypervariable regions A through F. For the sake of discussion right now, let's consider each of those hypervariable regions a locus, and the polymorphisms that exist within each of those loci as alleles. So we see there are basically 4 different variants of the hypervariable region A, and there are 4 different variants of B, 4 different variants of C, etc. And what those variants are listed in the 3rd column of where the amino acid polymorphisms reside. And the 4th column is what beads are represented by those particular polymorphisms. And all of this information was accumulated by Dr. Smith, put into the program that he developed, where I got my wish. I got to pretty much push a button and get the information that I was looking for. So in the upper left-hand corner of this slide, in the first box, is a list where I can type in, or from a drop-down menu, bring up HLA-DP 8501. On this box right underneath it, I get to ask the question, how many different hypervariable regions I want to compare this to. So what I'm first looking for are, does 8501 compare to any of the beads that are represented on our single antigen bead panel? And if the answer to that is no, there's no 6 out of 6 matches, I want to look at matches that are 5 out of 6 or perhaps 4 out of 6, just to get an idea of what it's closest to. And if you drop down to under the black line where it says hypervariable region, I have HLA-DP 8501 highlighted now, and it gives me what the particular, in this case, what the particular types are in each of these situations. Excuse me one second while this... Sorry about that. Phone rings, nothing I can do about an incoming call. And we have the 8501 hypervariable regions that are shown from left to right. and what it compares to. But in particular, what you can see here is that the 8501 expresses DEAV. Keep that in mind because that was our patient that we had as a potential, had an antibody against DEAV, and our donor was an 8501. We'll come back to that in a moment. I believe that DP85, and I don't know if it's on this slide, will tell me when I look at all the different alleles, yes, that HLA-DP85 has a 6 out of 6 match with HLA-DP2701. The reason it didn't show up on my first slide is 2701 is not a bead that's on the single antigen panel. And when I use this tool and push my buttons, which is all I'm trying to do, I get to see all of the other alleles that are at least a 5 out of 6 match with 8501 as it regards the different hypervariable regions. And you can see highlighted in red are all of these alleles that are expressing the DEAV hypervariable region F sequence. And then what that would mean to us is every one of those particular antigens would be considered unacceptable for our recipient who had a DEAV antibody. So, and here's going back to that same case, we had a patient who had a DEAV. Our donor, we now know from this simple drop-down menu, has DEAV, and if this were an offer to us, we would now say no.
So let's talk about, with all these concepts in mind about relationships between DP alleles, let's talk a little bit about typing and how to evaluate some typing reports. And let's give an example of the G or P alleles, or what we call the GP plus alleles, or alleles that have the same epitypes. Epitype is an interesting term. We can't take credit for that. This was coined by the people at Linkage Biosciences in doing their particular product. And the definition of these epitypes are alleles that have identical sequences at the 6 hypervariable regions. And now we know that includes the true G and P alleles and the ones that we call the G and P plus alleles, where there is a SNP outside, within exon 2, but outside of the hypervariable region, and may or may not impact the antibody reactivity of those hypervariable regions. So for the sake of our concept here, we're going to consider these all similar or same types of alleles. So let's look at a donor phenotype typing. And in this case, we have an ambiguous result of a 1701 or a 13101. And the conundrum here is our patient has antibodies to DP1701. The donor may be a 1701 or maybe a 13101. And in the middle of the night, you're saying, well, is this a compatible transplant, or is this an incompatible situation between the 17 and 17, or what's the relationship between 17 and 131? So we have to go look at the sequence of all this. And if we look at the sequence homology here on this particular slide, what we see is that the only difference across this exon 2 is nothing. The only difference occurs outside of exon 2 and exon 3. So 13101 is really a G allele of 1701. Very easily to see that. So we would consider that in this particular case to be the same allele, and it would be an incompatible transplant in our definition, or incompatible situation in our. And one can easily find this relationship if you go to the IMGT website. They actually have a nice table that shows you all the G alleles, basically for all the different loci. I'm just showing you the DPB1 here. And if we look at the 1701G, what we see is, sure enough, there's 131, also includes 168 and 460. So all these would be equivalent to 1701. So now how do we deal with all these particular alleles? So one is, in UNET right now, we have out for public comment and a change to the equivalency tables, and we've actually added in the G alleles as equivalencies for these parent alleles here, if you will. So going forward, if you put in, once this becomes part of UNET, which could take up to 18 months from now, once you put in your patient as having an antibody to 1701, any donor types at any one of these would be an automatic rule out on UNET. You wouldn't have to go in and try to manually figure this out for yourself. Or actually what some centers have done is they actually, if they know the person has an antibody to 1701, they would go in and put in these as avoids themselves. So we're trying to have UNET be a little bit smarter to help you figure this out in the long run. So let's look at one patient typing example here, see how we can help us understand these complex typings. So here we have a typing where the software, the SureTyper software from Linkage, has culled this down to L501, and it's highlighted because that's its best guess at what the actual allele really is based on frequencies, and a bunch of other alleles, and a 1701, and a bunch of other alleles. Now, it's difficult to tell from this. Now, one thing you can do with the software, and I didn't show it here, up in the upper right-hand corner of the software, there's a little button that says Show P Alleles. If you click that button in this case, you get what I'm showing here at the bottom of this slide. Now it's divided them out into the true P or G alleles, and this other group here, which we'll show you, are really our G, P plus allele group. And what this software is showing you across to the right is what we were just explaining, that all of these alleles are exactly identical across the 6 different hypervariable regions. Very easy to see this and sort this out. And just for demonstration purposes, let's look at the first allele of this big long string and the last allele in this big long string. And let's just look at the sequence a little closer. And what you can see here is they're identical across the 6 hypervariable regions. The only difference are in single nucleotide, single amino acid differences outside of any of the 6 hypervariable regions. So we would consider these all equivalent to 0501. And if our patient had antibodies to 0501, then these would be equivalent to 501. And if a donor had typed as a 31701, we actually would then absolutely rule this out. So just as a little aside here, well, some of this data you can actually find within the SureTyper software. There's actually a PDF that shows you all the epitypes as they're assigned, and just showing you the EDP5, the epitype 5, which has all the alleles that were carried over in the string here, and I've just highlighted the 38 and the 619 for demonstration purposes here. So if we think about then how this translates into what we do in donors in the middle of the night, if we go back to our example where the ambiguity was a 1701, 13101, if we have a true ambiguity, as in shown with the 1701, 131, then my recommendation, my personal recommendation, is that I would report the 1701 because we know that's an equivalent when 131 we've established is a G allele. If, on the other hand, the software is really able to unequivocally call the 131, then we're encouraging people to go ahead and report what you call. The software gets the 131, one of those higher numbered G alleles, put it down in the software. We're working hard in UNIT to make those equivalencies present so you don't have to go chasing that and saying, okay, what is 131, or what is 301, or 473, or 619? What are these equivalent to? We want the software to help us in the background. So that is what is my personal recommendation is for dealing with these different types of alleles. If you have an ambiguity that includes only G alleles or the G and P alleles, report the lowest member. If the software clearly identifies one of those G alleles, don't put the lower one, put the exact allele that you've identified.
So for the G and G plus alleles, those are, I think, some very good recommendations that we can apply on a day-to-day basis. I wanted to show another result that is going to be a little tougher, more challenging to evaluate. And in this particular case, we have a long string of alleles, and also something that jumps right out at us, if you see highlighted in red, our report from the SureTyper software tells us that the result that includes the most common alleles is one that can only occur if a well, at least one well, was changed. So that's a red flag that everybody on this call should be aware of right away. And the first thing that you should do is see what is the well that needs to be changed from what it was called to whatever it's going to have to be called in order to make this the appropriate result. So in this particular case, it was well L10. We go to well L10. We look at the data, and well L10 would have to be called negative in order for that previous reaction to be true. And what is very clear to me here, without looking at any other details, is this is not a negative well. I cannot accept this to change from positive to negative in order to make it fit these common allele patterns. So I'm going to take that out of the equation. I'm going to go back now, and I'm going to look at what the other possibilities are. And we see that we have two different types of options. I have an 0201 with an 0801, or I have a 1601 with a 188. And as you look on top and look at the epitopes, you see what the epitopes are for 0201, and you see what the epitopes are for 0801. And in particular, those two are different in hypervariable regions E and F. There's an M and a GGPM for 2 and a V and a DEAV for 8. If you take a look at what the alternative combinations are on the bottom of the slide, where I have 16 and 188, what I have are, again, the A, B, C, and D are the same hypervariable regions as we see above. And instead of the result that we were looking for on top for the DEAV and the GGPM, what we've gotten is a cis-trans ambiguity. Now what we see is the DEAV is on the 16 and the GGPM is on the 188. From a practical point of view, if you know your antibodies are against GGPM or against DEAV or against the M epitope in hypervariable region E or the V epitope in hypervariable region E, no matter what combination of antigens they are, the ones on top or the ones on the bottom, your ability to predict a cross-match as positive or negative based on the presence of those particular sequences is not impacted whatsoever by whether it's on chromosome number 1 or chromosome number 2 of this particular combination. By that I mean the maternal or the paternal chromosome. So in this particular case, what should you report? The answer is report whichever one you want to report and put a note into Histotrack, into the report that you're sending to UNet. And please, please, please take this as a recommendation that whenever you're submitting data to UNet with your report, don't just put in the face page. Put in the raw data so everybody has a chance to look at length at how the data were derived and be able to evaluate not just the summary, but the raw data itself. So in this particular case, if it was us at Emory, we'd be putting in the 2 and the 8, and we'd have a big note that says cannot rule out that it's a 16 and a 188.
So also on the software here, the software allows you to change calls from rare to not rare. So if you find in your population, you do studies and you find that DPP10801 is common in your population of donors in there, you actually can go into the software and manipulate and remove that E classification, and it will change somewhat how it does the analysis. But I'd reiterate Howie's plea to please include, when you're attaching into UNet, include as much raw data as you can. I was on call over this last weekend, and I had 2 offers from 2 different centers, and in both cases, all they did was include a typing face page from their final report, which is absolutely no different than what I saw in UNet, and is absolutely of no value, especially when you're offering kidneys for highly sensitized patients and you want to look at allele differences in there. So let's wrap up the talk here, because everybody has other things to do. So in summary, what we've tried to at least give you a little flavor for is the complexity of DPB1 related to the nomenclature, our challenges with the nomenclature. And as it currently, it's not very straightforward, and so doing the compatibility assessments is definitely not straightforward. There's a limited repertoire of BP1 alleles represented in the single antigen bead products currently available, which is a challenge. The DPB1 alleles not covered by single antigen beads do exist in the donor populations at reasonable frequencies, such that we have to think about those frequencies.
And so collectively, the virtual cross-matching that we want to do for patients with DP beta-1 antibodies can be very daunting and tedious, and right now primarily a manual process. As we've alluded to, there's software already available, some within SureTyper itself and others in development, that such as what Dr. Smith is using, as created for us, to be used that can help mitigate the compatibility assessment. And where Bob and I are particularly intrigued are with the concepts of applying epitopes and epitypes for compatibility assessment throughout the entire histocompatibility community. Now, this is going to warrant further investigation for routine clinical use. We're going to have to prove that it's true. But there are lots of different ways that this can be done, and we recommend that people start trying to apply this themselves. And just think about it. Well, with that in mind, I believe that we've covered essentially everything that we wanted to today. I have no doubt that we've forgotten some things. Bob and I are getting older, and our memories might not be what they used to be. But I think we're in pretty good company. There's another guy our age here who is basically going through the same phenomena himself. And with that, I thank you, and we'll start taking any questions you may have.
Yes, thank you.
So thank you very much for the presentation. Do have a question for you at this point from Dr. Andres Jaramillo. And he was curious about the expression of DP and how it compares to the expression of DR and TQ on endothelial cells and lymphocytes.
Well, Andres, that's a great question, and I think you know the answer, but I think the data that's out there, a little bit of data that's out there is that it appears that DP is probably not expressed to the same degree as AB and DR, maybe even DQ, on lymphocytes. But I don't think we have very good data how it's expressed on the endothelium. You know, the conundrum for me is that in people who've not had a transplant, we see very little DP antibodies produced, but in people who've lost grafts, that seems to be a major antibody produced post-transplant. So is there cause and effect associated with upregulation of DP when there's a rejection episode going on? Is it upregulation of DP because of damage to the graft, and really the DP antibodies are just surrogates for graft damage? There, we just don't know what the relationship is between what we're measuring on a lymphocyte when we're doing our cross-match, MFIs of what we're measuring for DP antibodies, and what really matters on the vasculature. I think that's, from a conceptual standpoint, that's an absolutely great question that we all need to be thinking about as we're looking at how patients respond in these particular scenarios.
Yeah, and just to amplify that a bit, those of us who sit in the laboratory on a day-to-day basis and look for antibodies, we're looking at half the equation. Well, we have to remember that it's a two-sided equation, and there are variables on both sides. We have the variability of what the antibodies are in the recipient, and then, as Bob just so elegantly described, the variability of the expression within the target. And that is not static. The target level can change from day to day, from hour to hour, based on the immunosuppression that's being given.
Or pro-inflammatory events can change the tone of the vasculature, and we have a number of examples of patients who are post-heart transplant and have tons of DQ antibodies and absolutely no pathology, and then something happens and all of a sudden they're in acute AMR where, a week ago they were doing just fine. Next question.
Yeah, another question just has to do with the number of epitopes known, and wondering if you think that just using the G or P groups can miss some DSAs for various patients, and how that might be an issue.
That's an absolutely great question, and I think we alluded to a little bit in the talk. I think that the GP/GP plus groups are going to get most of the antibodies, but I'm absolutely convinced that sooner or later somebody's going to show, because we have examples in A and B locus antigens, that a polymorphism that's 6 amino acids away from one of these hypervariable regions is going to impact the expression or the display of that particular hypervariable region and may alter our understanding of how that antibody may or may not bind to that. A classic example of this construct is if you take any one of your patients with a BW4 or BW6 antibody and you look at the MFIs, well, the BW4 or BW6 is pretty much a monomorphic epitope to most extents, but yet we have a display and difference of MFIs that may range from 10,000 to 5,000 MFI or 10,000 to 2,000 in the same patient. So if the sequence is the same, why is this antibody not reacting with the BW4 or 6 the same in all those particular antigens? And it's likely due to flanking sequences that impact the expression of that particular epitope. And I'm sure we're going to see a similar phenomena in DP. It's just that the data to date has, not that it won't be found tomorrow, but we haven't really shown that yet. And as Howie said, half of the antibodies that we find are to the DE/AV GGPM dimorphism, and a good another chunk are by one of the other epitopes. So I think that it will be present. We will see this. To what extent it's going to impact and how diverse it's going to be, and the instance of that we just don't know yet.
And we're seeing that in some of the other class 2 molecules, such as HLA-DQ, where the equivalent of the hypervariable region is the same between two different molecules, but we can still see an antibody develop in one of those people against the other, like a DQ alpha, DQ beta O201 making antibodies against somebody who's an O202 and vice versa. They share identical sequences over exon 2. Bob and I would be the first to tell you that we certainly anticipate that some of those antibodies are going to show up. How they play out clinically is a different question, and this is going to have to be in highly sensitized DP patients where they're going to play a major role, at least in our opinion.
We started just a couple of minutes late. I have one last question for you, and there was a question about the software and whether it was going to be commercially available.
So the software is still in development, and right now what we're doing is among colleagues that we've collaborated with for years, we're letting them work out some of the bugs. It's a beta version of it, and we're working hard towards getting this available for the entire community. So the answer is it will be out there. I'm not going to promise the check's in the mail yet, but it's on its way.
Well, Dr. Bray and Dr. Gebel, thank you very much for this very informative talk. There were many, many people on the line. I'm hoping that they enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're
Goodbye.
very welcome. Thank you.
And that, again, thank you. And if you have any other questions, please reach out to Linkage Biosciences support, and we'll try to help out in any way we can. Thank you.